Hey guys, my name's Dylan. I'm going to be going over the book of Esther for you guys, and we're going to be talking about things like the background, the date, the authorship, the theme, the purpose, the message, and the theology behind the book, as well as its place in the canon. So we're excited to get through it. The first thing we're going to be talking about is the background. So the story would have taken place during the reign of King Xerxes in Persia in 486 to 485 BC. And so this is from Brenneman and the New American Commentary. And so Merrill brings another side of this in The World and the Word, actually mentioning that while some of the Jewish people would have already made their way back to Jerusalem, that these people would have stayed for whatever purpose or reason, and most likely would be in the region of Susa within the Persian Empire. And so I just want to give a general overview of the events of the book, because the beauty of Esther is it is just a story. It is a narrative focused on telling a story. And so the first kind of event that sets this up is Queen Vashti is actually dethroned because of her disobedience to the king Xerxes. And so this leaves room for actually Esther to step in as queen after being considered worthy and brought in as queen by King Xerxes. So then we see this kind of other character come in named Haman, and he does not like the Jewish people. He would be considered an anti-Semitist. He would be considered anti-Semitic. And so he sets up this plot to actually stop or murder all of the Jewish people. And so this creates the conflict of the story. Mordecai actually figures this out, and he goes to Esther, who he knows, and asks her to go before the king to actually plead for the people. And then a funny kind of event happens in the meantime is Xerxes wakes from his rest and actually realizes that Mordecai was never honored for the great things he had done, and so actually makes Haman honor Mordecai. And then Esther going before the king, this little Jewish girl, who, if found unworthy, would have been killed by the king, asked for a banquet, and he obliged. And at that banquet, it was the king, Esther, and Haman, and he actually comes out and she tells the king of what Haman has done, and actually Haman is executed on the spot. And then because the king had made a decree in Persia, he could not override it. He could not override this decree to kill all of the Jewish people. And so he actually made another decree saying the Jewish people can defend themselves. Against his own people, he made that decree. And so that's the general overview of what's going on in Esther in the story. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth of the intricacies of the text. So the next discussion is the dating. Merrill writes in The World and the Word that some arguments point to a later date due to them saying that the Hebrew in the text is actually not the Hebrew of the time. And so there's no way that this could have had a earlier date than what some would prescribe, which usually was around 3rd or 4th century BC, kind of around the Maccabean Revolt era. But Merrill actually says that this is untrue, that the Hebrew in this actually coincides with Hebrew in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so there should be no date later than 470 BC, and more likely dates within the reign of King Xerxes. And to this, Brenneman actually agrees. He sets a little larger of a spectrum, but his dates fall within that general idea. And he also believed in an earlier date rather than a later date, more towards the Maccabean Revolt. Section is authorship, and so the author of Esther is anonymous. Bush in the WBC World Biblical Commentary says that there is no indication given or even hint that there is an author, and Merrill actually furthers this idea in World and the Word. However, the NAC, Bush kind of Brenneman actually gave some suggestions for authors, some that have been known, that have been common in antiquity to be names that come up. One is Ezra, another is men of the synagogue within the Talmud, and saying like the great men of the synagogue. And one more common than the other two is actually Mordecai, possibly being the author. But again, it's anonymous. We are not sure of who the author is. Next section is the general purpose of the book of Esther. And I want to be careful that the points are not redundant, but I think that furthers the ideas as we begin to talk about purpose and then about themes and theology. This same one idea keeps coming up, and it's because it has to be discussed in its different facets. And so the purpose of the book is twofold, according to Brenneman in the NAC, and he says it so well. And the first is to demonstrate God's providential care of his people, even the people that aren't a part of the nation of Israel, such as the king Xerxes, Haman, and all these other characters that aren't Jewish. And second would be to commiserate the Feast of Purim, which is actually started in the book of Esther, and encourage its observance in fortitude, because this is an event that happens in the midst of exile, in the midst of all these things, in the single most catastrophic event of the temple destruction. And now we have something where we see God actually, his hand back on his people. We see God now, instead of divorcing his people, like that imagery of the divorce of the temple destruction, now is bringing his people back, is rekindling that romance with his people. And that imagery here in the Feast of Purim, and it actually is read, or Esther, the book of Esther is read every year at the Feast of Purim as a reminder of what they're celebrating. So those are the two kind of purposes of the book as a whole. So next is the place of Esther in the canon. And so Dempster in Dominion and Dynasty sets up a great argument and a great just general talk about why we see Esther placed in between Daniel and then on the other end Ezra and Nehemiah, specifically more of why it comes after Daniel. And so there are some themes that I'll bring up and then we'll expound upon in the themes section. So the first is that it actually furthers, again, those themes I was talking about of the exile and persecution of the Israelites by the Persians. We'll talk about that in more depth. But also there's this great imagery that Dempster sets up that I loved. And it's this idea of why this continuation of the exile and how we see this and why we see the persecution is now we can look back at Daniel 7, which Esther is pointing us back to that with those same themes. And now we look back at Daniel 7 and we've transitioned from the persecution of the Lion of Babylon now to the persecution of the Bear of Persia, right? And so we see now, even now, right, the prophecy is being fulfilled, but there is more, and it has a eschatological nature as well, but we see the immediate effects of it. And so we continue those themes in the next section. So as we were discussing previously, we were going to continue those themes. And so with that idea of the exile and persecution by Persians, we see in many ways a reference now to the 70 weeks in David, which is reference to the Messiah. So we have this idea of them immediately being in exile and the continuation of this exile that's talked about and how they would have to live these 70 weeks. And again, we have the immediate coming true of the prophecy, the present coming true of the prophecy, but it has an eschatological nature that continues all the way through the entirety of the Bible. And so this imagery is just setting up even further this idea of what happens at the end of this 70-week exile. Well, there's the restoration of the people. There's coming back. And in the nature of the prophecy, it talks about the Messiah that would be killed and then his kingdom established. It is a direct reference to the Davidic covenant promised by God. And so it's a continuation of that idea from Daniel into Esther, in that this exile is still happening, and there will be a point in which God will bring his people back, which we see now in Ezra and Nehemiah, in which the people are starting to come back, right? And this end of the exile and the purification that happens within that book. And so, again, that's a major theme. And there's two others that are brought up. The first is said very well by Frederick Bush in the World Biblical Commentary. And it's this great reversal, right, of things happening. And this leads into our second theme. But those great reversals, Esther becoming queen, Mordecai being honored over Haman, Haman being hung on his own gallows that he built for Mordecai, the king allowing the Jews to fight back against his own people. And so we see actually the second theme come from that, in that it's God is working those things out providentially. And he continually does that despite the people. He works in spite of the people, even if it is non-Jewish. So those are the major themes that occur within Esther. The last section is theology. So what is the theology of Esther? And I think it was interesting that all of the commentaries that I read through, all of the books that I addressed, all mention this idea when it came to theology that while yes, God's name is not mentioned once in this book, the theology within the book is so important to recognize. And there's one main theological theme that arises, and there's some more minutia and things that people wanted to get caught up on with the Feast of Purim and things like that. But the one that was so central and seemed to be unanimous among all the people that I read was this idea of God's divine sovereignty. And even so, Merrill states and paints a beautiful picture that the theology of the book has to be viewed through a lens of divine sovereignty, of understanding that while yes, all of this is happening because of God. And so God is still protecting his people. This idea of God's divine sovereignty, his divine hand in working out this great reversal of victim to victor of the people, of the Jewish people, of Esther, Mordecai. We see God now has placed his hand back on his people. He is now protecting his people once again as he has promised in his covenants. And he is a hesed, love-keeping, covenant-keeping God, right? And he has continued to show that. And he is sovereign. He is working it out. He has his hand on his people. So just in conclusion, what does it mean for us today? What does the book of Esther mean for us today? And I think it is absolutely an overwhelming image of God's sovereignty and his immanence with his people, right? And we have been grafted into the family, right? Because of the new covenant. We are now sharing in the same promises gifted to the people. Now, are we sharing in the same promises given to Israel? No, I do not believe I will be restored to the land of Israel because I'm not Jewish, right? That has nothing to do with my history, and it may not even mean something to me. But what it does mean is that same sovereign God worked out a plan to create and work out the ministry of Jesus and to create the story of Jesus in the gospel. And that is where my hope and my assurance is. And so knowing that same sovereign God was working in past and he's still working, and he even protected the seed in this story of Jesus, shows that he is that same covenant keeping God. Thank you.